Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're so delighted that so many of you can join us today for the 12th Goodman Lecture. My name is Trent Walker. I am part of the Academic Development Committee here at Khyentse Foundation. I'm also a postdoc at the Host Center for Buddhist Studies at Stanford University, and I'll be your host again today for this lecture. As you note, since this is the 12th lecture in this series, it means that we have now completed the first year of the Goodman Lectures, and with next month's lecture, which I'll say a little bit about at the very end of the event, we are beginning the second year of this series. So I know many of you who are present on the call today have been to a number or even all of the lectures in this series. We really appreciate your presence, your questions, and your interest in this series as we again try to extend the legacy of Professor Goodman, as well as build bridges between the kinds of academic work that's one part of what Khyentse Foundation supports, and the broader work of the foundation, as well as general audiences who would like to connect with and learn more about what's happening in terms of cutting-edge research in Buddhist studies. So if you're here new in this lecture series for the first time today, I encourage you to check out the website of Khyentse Foundation at khyentsefoundation.org, as well as specifically more information, including about past and future talks in this series at khyentsefoundation.org/the Goodman Lectures. Should any technical issues or questions arise, I invite you to send a chat message to KF Tech Support, and Candice will be delighted to address any of your questions. To ask questions for our speaker today, Professor Hartmann, please send a chat message to KF Q&A, and Lynn of the Khyentse Foundation will relay those questions to me, and I will be able to ask selected questions to our speaker today. So you can send those questions any time to KF Q&A. Unfortunately, questions sent to me directly, I won't be able to ask those, but please send them to KF Q&A. So, as you know, today's event features a lecture by Professor Jens-Uwe Hartmann of Munich University, and on the subject of out of town yet bound to it, how the early Buddhists organized seclusion and survival. And like all of the events so far in the Goodman Lecture series, we are trying to highlight some of the partnerships that Khyentse Foundation has with Buddhist studies programs at universities across the world. And the University of Munich is one place where we're very excited to have to support a new professorship in Tibetan Buddhist studies, and that the project is still underway, but we look forward in the future to be able to share more details about that when it's ready. Our distinguished speaker today is well known in the Buddhist studies world for his very extensive contributions to the philological study of Buddhist manuscripts, particularly in Indian languages, as well as their parallels in Tibetan and Chinese. And among the most salient contributions of Professor Hartmann to the field of Buddhist studies have been his work with extremely rare and fragmentary and fascinating manuscripts in Sanskrit and Prakritic languages from South and Central Asia, including some areas known as Greater Gandhara in Afghanistan and Pakistan, that preserve examples of very important Buddhist sutras, narratives, and also devotional poetry. So, for instance, the work of Professor Hartmann on the stotras, or these sutras of praise to the Buddha and Bodhisattvas in Sanskrit, including the Varanarha, Varana Stotra of Matra Cheta, have been the subject of groundbreaking research by Professor Hartmann. Also in terms of Buddhist narrative literature, such as Avadana literature, including the subject of Professor Hartmann's PhD work on the Chandraprabha Avadana, have been also places where all of us in Buddhist studies have learned quite extensively from Professor Hartmann. And then more recently, in terms of his work on one of the most extraordinary and best preserved examples of a Sanskrit text representing early or mainstream Buddhism, this being the manuscript in Sanskrit of the Dirghagama, that has been the subject of quite extensive research by Professor Hartmann and his colleagues over the past more than 30 years. And what is extraordinary in reading through Professor Hartmann's work, and the link shared in the chat here is a link to many of his publications. You'll note that many of those are available in full open access. So if you're interested in following up on some of the themes in his work, I encourage you to check those out there. But something that's extraordinary, if you dig into those works, they're often extremely technical in dealing with these just tiny fragments that have survived of these precious texts. And yet in other dimensions of Professor Hartmann's work, he shows us much more of the big picture. How do these texts and stories and ideas transmitted in early Buddhist literature fit into the broader cultural and religious history of the region? And that ability to be able to look very closely at the philological dimensions as well as these broader historical dimensions of religion and literature are part of what makes Professor Hartmann so treasured throughout the Buddhist studies world. So without further ado, I would like to, once I think we were having a brief moment of technical difficulty here, but soon I would like to be able to invite Professor Hartmann to share his lecture with us on Out of Town yet Bound to It. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Hartmann. The floor is yours.
First of all, I wish to thank the Khyentse Foundation for the incredible support we received or we will receive in Munich. Much could be said about it. This is not the right moment to do so, but still I want to express my heartfelt thanks for this. I also wish to thank for inviting me to talk in this prestigious lecture series. And third, I would like to thank the staff members of the Khyentse Foundation, and especially Trent Walker. Trent, not only for his kind introduction, but also for organizing this event in a, let me say, remarkably unobtrusive and very efficient manner. Finally, like Trent, I'm tempted to say good evening, which is fitting for the place of the world where I'm living. But for others like Trent, it is still early morning, and for still others, it may already be the 29th of May, those in the Far East. I'm afraid this is an unavoidable side effect of the digital format, which, however, it also has its advantages. For instance, no traveling, a very good measure to reduce our carbon footprint. Now, let me explain what I intend to do in the next something like 45 minutes. I want to summarize my views on how early Buddhism became an urban phenomenon. For this, I draw on the observations of many other scholars, most notably, of course, Gregory Chopin, but also Andy Rodman, Peter Skilling, and various others. And I try to combine these observations with my own understanding. Why this topic? 2 years ago, I was invited to participate in Germany in a research group on religion and urbanity, which started me thinking on the topic. Another reason is the fact that it concerns the earliest period of Buddhism, and this may be interesting for everybody, no matter to which later tradition one feels personally inclined or on which geographical area one's academic interest is focused. Now I try to start the screen sharing. And I hope it works. Trent, if it doesn't, please inform me.
Yes, it works perfectly. Thank you.
That's great. And so now it should work.
It's perfect.
My talk addresses the way in which a religious movement changes from a group of homeless, dispossessed world renouncers to an organization living in well-built monasteries. According to its self-description, Buddhism started as a movement of itinerant mendicants who left society and preferred lonely places and seclusion for their habitat. We have the very famous verses of the Kaggavisana Sutta in the Pali Sutta Nipata with the refrain Eko Chare Kaggavisana Kalpo. In the Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, one should live alone like a rhinoceros horn, or in the old translation by Faustbill, let one wander alone like a rhinoceros. This is the refrain of all the 41 verses. With this, which development now is necessary in order to end up in a place like Drepung, the largest monastery not only in Tibet, but probably in world history. This is a place about 10 kilometers away from Lhasa, which housed a population of more than 10,000 monks prior to the dramatic changes after Tibet's occupation by the People's Republic of China. And this is a view of one of the two faculties, Lose Ling, which was of the re-establishment in India, the monks in the main hall, which gives you at least a vague impression of the number of people assembled there. The old monastery, although located in the countryside, it had become a veritable town in itself. As you see from this example, we know the result, but the beginnings of this process are still in the dark. The early phase of this transition has received not so much attention in Buddhist studies. I hesitate to call it a neglect. We have severe problems with the sources. But we see that Buddhist monks and nuns became sedentary, and they became connected to urban centers. This must have been a slow and gradual process. But why did they do so? How did they do it? And how did they negotiate the ongoing tension between remoteness and urbanity, or in the somewhat catchy words of the title, between seclusion and survival? In the following, I will describe what we know or believe to know, how we know it, and describe some of the steps in this development. I do this from a historical and academic perspective. I try to describe a historical process, and there is absolutely no judgment intended. In this process, Buddhism seems to give up exactly the values and attitudes that were characteristic and causal for its inception. Throughout its history, this invited criticism, and movements to counter the development have been constant throughout the history. I only mention the tradition of forest monks in Thailand, or if we stay in the Tibetan realm, the binary role models of the scholar monk, here two scholars in discussion, on the one side, and the hermit on the other side. For instance, the famous Milarepa. There is a tension, but I'm inclined to call it a very fruitful tension, fruitful for the vitality of Buddhism as a living religion, which has constantly to adapt and therefore to change. Now, the emergence of Buddhism is closely associated with the so-called second phase of urbanization in ancient India. This is important. From its very beginning, urbanity and Buddhism are products of the same environment. We could describe the relationship as a phenomenon that began with an extreme disentanglement, but rather quickly changed into a process of re-entanglement. And during the first phase of more or less complete disentanglement, regulations became introduced that were useful for a complete separation from society, but proved cumbersome when rapprochement with society became desirable and even necessary. Since these regulations were considered to have been prescribed by the Buddha himself, they could not simply eliminate it. I will describe certain measures in the early process of that reversal, which aim at bridging the divide between the demands of the ascetic life and the more and more strongly felt need for a closer contact with society, and especially with its affluent members who did not reside in the villages, but in the urban centers. Here it is necessary to say something about dates, a notoriously difficult task in ancient India. Despite great efforts by scholars from many fields, the exact date of the Buddha remains disputed. It hinges on the fairly well-established dates of King Ashoka, who ruled the first major empire in India, and the red lines show the extension of this empire. Buddhist chronology places the death of the Buddha either 100 or 218 years before the coronation of Ashoka, which is usually dated to 268 before the Common Era. This ruler is famous for his inscriptions, several of which are devoted to Buddhist topics. They offer the earliest reference to Buddhism. This is the pillar inscription in Lumbini with the birthplace of the Buddha, with the famous sentence, Ida Buddhe Jate, here the Buddha was born. These inscriptions show that Buddhism had already become an observable, if not a major, factor in the religious setting of at least Northeast India. And they also suggest a beginning connection between homeless mendicants and centers of power. Early Buddhist sources, and specifically the records of the life of the Buddha, describe a pre-Ashokan landscape that consists of petty states with capitals and villages subsisting on agriculture and forests and jungles in between. There's a clear distinction between members of an urban community and peasants. Buddhism describes itself as a movement of wandering ascetics who live in the wilderness and shun not only the cities, but every inhabited place. The only point of contact between the ascetic and society is a visit to the villages for the daily support, the so-called alms round. And this follows the all Indian model of the ascetic who leaves society goes into homelessness, as the technical term says, in order to undisturbedly pursue these ascetic practices. In the earliest phase of Buddhism, the individual practitioner distances himself from other people, even from his fellow brethren, and especially from the urban population. A specific genre of texts of this phase is so-called ascetic poetry, verses that warn about the dangers and distractions of non-solitude, of mingling with people, of family bondage, and so on. The Kagavisana Sutta, the Rhinoceros Sutta I just mentioned, is one of them, famous one. Such a way of life would not normally leave many material traces, if any at all. The sheer survival of Buddhism and its success point in a very different direction. They appear to be connected to urban centers. The second urbanization, I mentioned it already, in northern India took place around the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era, and it coincided with important religious transformations. These transformations led to the emergence of many new movements. According to Buddhist sources, the Buddha lived in a religious environment similar to what we today call the market of religions, where countless different teachers propagated their way to salvation. However, all these movements shared a set of common features inherited from earlier times, among them a strong preference for ascetic practices. Also inherited was the idea of an immediate connection between asceticism and the generation of certain psychophysical powers. Such powers were not accessible to an ordinary person living in the middle of society. And therefore, it was considered imperative to leave society if one wished to generate such powers, or in a next step to achieve spiritual progress or even liberation. It appears that many and perhaps most of these groups were what we would call today dropout movements. As Robert Scharf puts it, quote, in the early period at least, the Buddhist institution known as the Sangha comprised a renunciate community that embodied, quite literally, a critique of mainstream social values and cultural norms. It necessitated a radical change in the way one lived. One was required to opt out of family ties and worldly pursuits and opt into an alternative, communal, celibate, and highly regulated lifestyle. End of quote. This left no room for earning a living. Labor for securing one's subsistence was considered a dangerous distraction, and as a rule, ascetics abstained from working. But for their living, they depended on material gifts such as food and clothing provided by society. And here we observe the emergence of a dual order. One could even say, one could even call it a division of labor. Ordinary people produced a surplus, which enabled them to feed religious specialists. And these specialists, in turn, were tasked with the upkeep of the cosmic order. More specifically, they were expected to generate the supernatural powers necessary for manipulating the world in order to secure and maintain favorable conditions for individuals, families, and the society at large. Inevitably, this model promoted rivalry among the religious groups, since all had to compete for the same material resources. What then did the Buddhist monks and nuns have to offer as compensation for the material support they received? Or in modern economic language, what was, and allow me this term, what was the market value of their religious expertise? And this is far from easy to answer, since we have no literary sources which would exactly describe what kind of services the monks and nuns offered and what they expected in return. But here we have to remember one of the major side effects of the second urbanization. It invited and necessitated trade. And when Ashoka united nearly the whole subcontinent into one empire, long-distance trade began to prosper. This thriving trade experienced another boost when, shortly before the beginning of the Common Era, India became linked to the Silk Road. This network of both land and maritime routes, and I show you only the land routes, which connected Rome and the Mediterranean world in the west with Persia, India, Central Asia, and the Far East. Long-distance trade was highly profitable, but also highly hazardous. And a merchant must have been in dire need of every form of protection available. When we scrutinize passages in early Buddhist literature that address merchants and trade, we find many indications for a close connection. At several points in the biography of the Buddha, traders appear and take an active role, and the most important supporter of the Buddha is an extremely rich merchant, Anathapindata. We will briefly come back to him. And then we have quite a few and evidently very popular narrative texts telling the adventures of groups of merchants who unite for a trade trip, either by ship on the ocean or overland by caravan. And these stories tell of the countless dangers the merchants had to face. And usually there's a Buddhist turn in the plot where the merchants are saved from a deadly peril and able to return home. Finally, there are a number of apotropaic texts, protective texts, that promise a trader protection. And interestingly, sometimes not only for him, but also for his profit. Protection from all the hostile non-human beings that he may encounter on his trip. It is surely not by chance that a number of so-called conversion stories report how the Buddha with his supernatural powers subdued the most prominent among those non-humans and, importantly, made them promise henceforth to protect his followers. Such texts remain part of certain Buddhist rituals until today, and they point to one of the possible attractions that monks and nuns had to offer in the religious market. It seems that during the early centuries, Buddhist apotropaic rituals were considered especially successful, which would explain the enormous support, particularly by merchants. This rather general picture does not explore every angle of the mutually beneficial relations between merchants and Buddhist practitioners, but it provides us with enough clues to be sure that there were such relations and very close relations. When a religious movement grows, it needs to build up an infrastructure in order to maintain continuous support. This requires constant interaction between the two social domains, the worldly and the religious. The relations between monks or nuns and their lay followers are regulated in the Vinaya, an extensive law code for the members of the order. Many of these regulations concern the individual behavior. There are, for instance, a number of rules how to behave when invited for a meal into the house of a layperson, and there are rules how to enter such a house, how to behave while eating, and so on. These rules are clearly designed to generate respect for the monks and nuns, one of the preconditions for the voluntary support of the order. However, such support seems to be taken for granted, and from the Vinaya, we learned very little about economics and the intricacies of securing the day-to-day survival of a community of monks or nuns or of a monastery. It appears that by the beginning of the Common Era, monks and nuns had transformed from a community of wandering ascetics into groups of people living together in permanent residences. This is confirmed by archaeological sources, and these sources reveal the surprising find that the majority of the monasteries were situated in the countryside. This phenomenon is easily explained by recourse to the Vinaya. It prescribes that monasteries for male inhabitants have to be exclusively in the countryside, while those inside a settlement were reserved for the nuns. Monks are allowed to stay only in the vicinity of a settlement, not too close, but also not too far, as the Vinaya says. The reason for this prescription is quite clear. It echoes the original ascetic way of life. Male practitioners should keep a distance from society, at least spatially. However, as a necessary concession to their sustenance, the distance to the next settlement should not be too far in order to facilitate, for instance, the daily alms round. Convents of nuns, on the other hand, had to be located within a settlement. Here, the Vinaya prescribes that nuns, contrary to the monks, are forbidden to live in the wilderness. This restriction most likely reflects an adaptation to the ancient Indian social environment, where females were generally limited to the domestic sphere. The division between the nuns living within a settlement and the monks who had to stay outside entailed various consequences. There were clear advantages on the side of the nuns. They were in immediate and constant contact with the urban society, and they had direct access to donors and other facilities. Monks had to lure potential donors to their monasteries. However, the countryside opened up other possibilities. Monasteries could, for instance, turn into focal points of rural development by providing capital and technology. The very few cases where relevant sites have been excavated suggest that monasteries introduced decisive changes in the agriculture, for instance, by installing water supply necessary for crops like paddy. Very likely, monasteries played an important part in the cultivation of fertile land. There are very few cases where the Vinaya addresses the divide between living in town and in the countryside. However, there is one especially telling example, already discussed by Gregory Chopin, but it is simply too nice not to be mentioned here. The Vinaya adopts the general ancient Indian attitude to gender and clearly differentiates between the status of monks and nuns. Nuns are subordinated to the monks in every regard. This subordination also concerns religious education. Nuns are assigned a male instructor, and such an instructor must have certain qualities, and the Vinaya, in its wonderful love of detail, elaborates on the requirements necessary for a monk to become eligible as an instructor. One such requirement is competence in urban speech. The Sanskrit word carries the connotation culture, and the ancient commentaries confirm this understanding when they explain urban speech with language of the court or elegant speech. Nuns lived inside the settlements and participated in all facets of urban life. And this resulted in a different diction, or in linguistic terms, in a different code. Instructor monks were thus required to code switch in order to be taken serious by their female students. One of the major concerns throughout the Vinaya is to enforce a behavior that preserves respect. First of all, the respect of lay followers for monks and nuns, but also the respect for the nuns, of the nuns for the monks. It is equally clear that the nuns' exposure to an urban environment was a factor to be reckoned with in securing such respect for their instructing monks. The monks' ability to use the register of refined speech doubtlessly aimed at saving them from embarrassment, from being ridiculed by their female students as something like country bumpkins. It seems that the redactors of the Vinaya considered nuns to be decidedly more urban than monks, a surprising admission in view of the above-mentioned general attitude towards women in ancient India. The Vinaya is also aware of the need for coping strategies for dealing with an urban elite. Monks had to compensate for the disadvantage of living outside of the urban centers, although the urban elite was the main source for donations. Such donations were indispensable for the upkeep of a monastery. And this left only two possibilities, either for monks to go to town or to bring the city dwellers out to the monastery. The second possibility was probably more effective. A monk was forbidden to stay in town overnight, but a visitor from town might spend the night in the monastery. And therefore, a monastery had to be made into a place worth visiting, especially by a member of the upper urban class, the urban upper class. And therefore, it had to serve two rather different ends. One, to provide the right setting for an ascetic withdrawn from society, and on the other, to create a contact zone for interactions with that society. In the following, I will present a few examples of how early Buddhists increased the attraction of a monastery for visitors from a city. But before this, I will deal with the paradigmatic first donation of a plot of land to the Buddhist community for the purpose of building residential quarters. And the central figure in this story is Anathapindata, an extremely rich merchant and a devoted follower of the Buddha. He was an inhabitant of Shravasti, one of the major towns in northeast India, which figures prominently in the biography of the Buddha. Anathapindata wished to provide the Buddha and his monks with a location where they could spend the 3 months of the rainy season, when the monks had to interrupt their itinerant lifestyle due to the climatic conditions. Of course, Anathapindata had to find a location outside of town. As the story goes, he settled on the Jetavana, the grove of Prince Jeta, a park on the outskirts of Shravasti. Prince Jeta, according to the story, demanded that the whole ground of the Jetavana was to be covered with coins. But Anathapindata accepted, bought the grove, and presented it to the Buddha. The story provides one of the rare occasions where we have early dating. And the main scenes are preserved in a stone relief at the railing of the great stupa of Barhut. Today, and I say great stupa, today the stupa is completely destroyed. But 150 years ago, even part of the railing which surrounded the stupa was still standing. And I show you two old photographs of this railing, because they give you an idea how the following image, a medallion, is placed at one of the pillars of this railing. This relief can be dated to the 2nd or 1st century before the Common Era. It has an inscription at the bottom which reads, Anatapindada, translated. Anatapindada donates the Jetavana after having bought it for a covering with 10 millions. The story mentions the ridiculously high price for the plot, which is illustrated by the relief. It depicts several workers in the right part and near the bottom, several workers unloading plates full of coins from an ox cart. And you see the ox cart just at the bottom. And laying the square coins, this is important, coins at that time in India were square, and laying the square coins on the ground. The story serves to set up Anatapindada as the Buddhist role model for both a wealthy donor and a rich merchant. It also tells us that towns were surrounded not only by wilderness or arable land, but also by places in easy reach that could be used for diversion and pleasure. These places must have been the perfect location for ascetics who were not allowed to live in the town, but had good reason for staying in contact with its inhabitants. The acquisition of the Jetavana is a paradigmatic narrative in several regards. As mentioned above, it offers the role model, it offers the model for a rich donor, but it also introduces for the first time the possibility for the monks to stay in a permanent place. And it points to locations for a permanent residence. The story goes on. Anatapindada has a building constructed for a statue of the Buddha, and all this is approved by the Buddha himself, and therefore the story has to be located within the Buddha's lifetime. However, it is rather unlikely, if not impossible, that the transformation of an ascetic lifestyle to a community of resident monks and nuns took place within a few decades. Not to mention the statue of the Buddha, which would not have been available before the beginning of the Common Era. Doctrinally, the Vinaya purports to describe events in which the Buddha himself took part, since every rule needs to be sanctioned by him, by the Buddha, in order to become valid. Historically, however, the Vinaya must be understood as a constantly growing collection of rules that mirrors a long process of transformation, during which a group of homeless ascetics slowly turned into a monastic community. The required legitimation made it necessary to condense this long transformative process into the lifetime of a single person, the Buddha. This is the moment to turn to the ancient Indian garden. There must have been an elaborate garden culture, both inside and outside of towns, and we are expressly informed in the Vinaya that men of the cities love gardens. Gardens played a role in the life of the upper class. One of the standard Sanskrit terms for garden is arama, which basically means pleasure, a place for pleasure, pleasure ground, or park. The Buddhists adopted this word as one of their two main designations for a word which we normally translate as monastery. The Vinaya does not give a reason for choosing the term arama, but the descriptions of such a place suggest that the choice was intentional. There must have been the wish to motivate an urban population to leave their town, come to the countryside, and visit the specific variant of a pleasure ground that was created by the monks for offering both worldly and spiritual diversion. It is a recurring topic in the Vinaya that ladies of the urban elite included the visit of a monastery in their program when they went for an excursion to see the gardens. All this holds equally true for the second and probably more widespread Buddhist term for a monastery, vihara. The standard meaning of this Sanskrit term is walking or touring for pleasure, and it also denotes the locality, the place for recreation, the pleasure ground. The terms convey a message, and this message has several connotations. First, a monastery for monks is located outside of a town and is part of the surrounding nature. Second, this nature is not to be mistaken for wilderness. Third, a monastery participates in the overall garden culture and should be considered equally attractive as a garden. Last, this is not a message primarily addressed to the working class. If the monks wished to attract the social elites, they had to take the necessary measures, offering them an environment that promised recreation facilities similar to those of the parks around an urban center was a first step. But to make sure that the monastery was not just one among many possible places for an excursion, further attractions had to be added. The garden served as the background that generated a mood of pleasure. In the foreground, art and architecture served as attractions. The monasteries were usually built of stone, and their architecture adopted and copied urban forms. Stone architecture facilitates murals, and paintings are frequently mentioned in the Vinaya. Luckily, a few rare examples of paintings are preserved from ancient India. The most famous are the cave monasteries of Ajanta in Maharashtra, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. These caves contain plenty of narrative paintings, which are not only of the highest quality, but also demonstrate knowledge of an advanced court culture through scenes showing kings and queens and members of the urban elite. It is easy to imagine that such paintings could add considerably to the touristic value of a monastery, even in the eyes of the culture. They were an obvious bonus for a visitor on a garden tour. But there were other attractions too. Probably around the beginning of the Common Era, the Buddha image, the anthropomorphic representation, was created. This innovation had a tremendous impact, and cult images began to appear in all the monasteries very quickly. The urban origin of architecture, paintings, and sculpture is evident. There are further means for generating an aesthetic sentiment through stimulation of the sense organs, but some of these means are out of our reach. I'm thinking especially of music, both vocal and instrumental, music that plays an important role in all Buddhist traditions throughout Asia, but on which the early Buddhist texts keep completely silent. Of course, there are countless references to music and instruments in descriptions of either courtly or urban environments, but as far as I am aware, they never refer to monks or monasteries. Another sensory impression in a Buddhist monastery, of which we know slightly more, is scent. Again, it was Gregory Chopin who drew attention to the field of olfactory imagination in Buddhism and the fact that images could be impregnated with fragrance. There is one more aspect which has great sensory potential, although it is not an urban phenomenon. Similar to the garden, it provides the city dweller with impressions that sound highly attractive, even to our modern taste. I'm speaking of the site of a monastery and the preference for sites that open up onto a spectacular panorama and allow a breathtaking view. Again, Chopin draws attention to this phenomenon, which holds true for a garden and a monastery, when he says that in this case, it is not the view of the garden or the vihara, the monastery, it is the view from both that is responsible for this kind of aesthetic experience. He also points to early Western archaeologists of the 19th century in India who repeatedly remarked on the sometimes stunning natural beauty of the sites of Buddhist monasteries. The beauty of a monastery is a central concern, and the Vinaya does not leave us in doubt as to the main reason. I cite only one story in order to exemplify this point, and this brings me already to the end of my talk. The story tells how a sponsor in a rural hamlet had a monastery, a vihara, built with only one monk spending the rainy season there. However, this monk was energetic and took very good care of the monastery. It was well maintained. The text goes on and quote, and sited in a lovely isolated spot adorned with all sorts of trees, filled with the soft sounds of geese and curlews, peacocks and parrots, miners and cuckoos, miners an Indian bird, and cuckoos adorned with various flowers and fruits. End of quote. Sorry. This perfectly reproduces the standard descriptions of the ancient Indian garden. Then, however, the text goes on to report a specific event. Once, a wealthy trader spent the night in that monastery. When he saw the beauty of that monastery and the beauties of its woods, he was deeply moved. And although he had not seen the monks, he dispatched in the name of the community a very considerable donation. The story contains all the important elements. A monastery located in an isolated spot. It imitates a pleasure garden. The residents strive to make the monastery beautiful. It may serve as a resting place, particularly targeted at wealthy groups such as merchants. Visitors are impressed by the site's beauty. Their emotional reaction may result in a single donation or, as we learn from other similar accounts, in sustained support. The monks themselves do not play a significant part in the story, which expressly states their absence. The trader is impressed by the location, not by the spiritual accomplishments of its inhabitants. Refreshingly, there is no attempt to hide the immediate purpose of the embellishments. They are clearly meant to address and impress the refined tastes and sentiments of an urban upper class. And there are many more stories that illustrate the effects of such sites, often mentioning that people came to see a monastery and its wonders. With the power of aesthetics, the Buddhist monks were able to do more than merely compensate for the apparent disadvantage of their forced accommodation in the countryside. To the contrary, they had something to offer to the urban elite that was simply not available in the city. A combination of urban refinements expressed by art and architecture and rural experiences such as an encounter with domesticated nature in a garden or a spectacular view of the landscape. There are many passages in the Vinaya that not only approve of this concern with beauty, but actively support it. They underline that beauty, aesthetics, and refinement were no longer seen as this worldly concerns that distracted from and potentially prevented spiritual progress. They had become a means to an end, and they were used extensively. Much more could be added, but here it must suffice to summarize the basic findings. When Buddhist monks became sedentary, their rules forced them to settle in the hinterlands. The original distancing from society resulted in a religious and economic disadvantage. As a means to bridge the divide between the urban and the rural, monks made use of the urban elite's openness or even susceptibility to aesthetic sentiments by combining strong stimuli taken from both the urban and the rural backgrounds. In their attempt to turn weakness into strength, the monasteries became focal points for aesthetics and sensual attractions. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that they initiated Buddhist art, thereby creating a tremendous cultural heritage that has been and still is enjoyed and admired for 2,000 years, and not least by us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hartmann, for this extraordinary lecture. And in extremely clear terms, you've outlined for us the ways in which the physical setting of early Buddhist monasteries, particularly where Buddhist monks were living, resulted in a whole lot of important cultural and religious changes that you've spelled out for us. At this juncture, maybe it would be best to stop sharing the screen so we can see you more easily. Thank you. And this is the time for all of us to submit any questions that you'd like to ask to Professor Hartmann in regards to his talk. So again, as I said at the beginning of this event, please submit those via chat to KF Q&A, and then those questions will be relayed to me. So while we're waiting, Professor Hartmann, for questions to come in, I hope you don't mind if I begin with some of my own in regards to your talk. So there's a number of really important layers to your talk, and I really appreciated the way you laid out the order of your argument so clearly for us. I want to come back to one thing that seems to be a really important distinction that you're making, and ask you to say a little bit more about the broader cultural ramifications of it. And that's this distinction between gardens on one extreme and wilderness on the other. And kind of this idea of domesticated nature maybe being somewhere in between, including places that aren't quite a garden where you have this view where the monastery is in this bucolic setting, but again, isn't the feared wilderness. And as we know say in a Western European context, our contemporary ideas around nature are very much informed by cultural discussions that took place largely post-Enlightenment, but especially in the Romantic era. And I'd love to hear more about how ideas around gardens and also wilderness were changing in Indian culture at the time you're describing.
Again, we always have a problem with the sources. We don't have two very different from the European discussions, pre-Enlightenment and Enlightenment discussions, where we have endless sources. In ancient India, it's very difficult, very, very different and difficult. What we know also from non-Buddhist sources, and especially from non-Buddhist sources, that the wilderness, and this is the jungle, is extremely dangerous. So there are three kinds of dangers. animals, robbers, and non-human beings, which wait for the traveler. And this, I addressed that especially when trade started, trade caravans were endangered on the way between the urban centers. And so they needed protection for that purpose. They didn't pass through gardens, quite the opposite. So what do we know about the garden culture around these early cities? Very little, actually. These are indirect hints, which we take, for instance, from the story of Anathapindata, that he buys a garden park or something outside of town, which, and we have many, but always this in the same, more or less the same wording, places where in the Buddhist text it is said that people make a tour from garden to garden, outside of the city. So apparently this is something, it sounds quite modern, like leaving the town for pleasure, going perhaps for a picnic, we don't know that. But this is what comes to mind with our view on such, our modern view on such excursions. And the garden in and outside the town, I tried not to focus on that so much. In the non-Buddhist literature is highly loaded with erotic sentiments, with erotic ideas, and especially in the time before the monsoon comes. So the garden is an area where there have been where there are pavilions, small buildings where couples may retire and sit together. And there are endless references to such occasions. Also in non-Buddhist literature, it's really, and as I said, a lot of the description I mentioned with the birds and the flowers, and so this at the end of this monastery, this is actually, this is slightly sexually loaded. If you know the references to gardens in other contexts. One very interesting source in that context would be the well-known Kama Sutra, for instance, a non-Buddhist text, culturally extremely interesting, providing many extremely important informations on the urban life, especially of the upper class. If it is taken to be on face value, this is another problem of these ancient sources. We never know to which degree they describe a reality or an imagination. So, but it seems that with the garden culture, then, since we have so many clues from different texts and different angles, this must have been something quite important. And gardens, they were in, this is a, what's the English word? Liminal area or so?
Liminal, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, between the wilderness and the urban, the settlement. And so perfectly fitting for, and not only for Buddhist ascetics, also for other groups, it seems. So when there are Brahmanical ascetics, they live in, it's interesting, they live in an ashrama. The Buddhists did not make use of this term. I would say because they wanted to differentiate themselves from this tradition. But ashramas, their description in poetry is quite similar to what we find in Buddhist and other non-Buddhist sources. So this is domesticated nature. Girls are moving around and watering the flowers, the plants, and so. So does that partly, at least, it doesn't fully answer because your question, because we don't have this kind of discussion which you referred to in more recent times in Europe. But there is some material to have a similar discussion about the situation in ancient India. And garden was something which was not threatening. Wilderness, aranya would be one of the words, was something else. Hermits, they may live in the aranya, so they are not restricted. Single hermits, they can live everywhere. And the farther away from inhabited places, the better.
Thank you. And I want to return to this question about hermits in just a sec, because we have some audience members who've asked about it. I wanted to, before going there, jump into one follow-up question to this framing around nature, and something you mentioned in your response, which I think really clarifies this cultural setting for us, is the dimensions of gender and sexuality in terms of the framing of nature, urbanity, and the garden, the wilderness. And something that was really quite striking in your talk was the specific placement of male monastics outside of the city versus nuns inside of the city. Something else that struck me in that comparison in thinking about Vinaya texts is that the various Vinaya traditions for bhikshunis, for nuns, are quite concerned with avoiding sexual violence towards nuns, and also the dangers of the wilderness or nuns who are living on their own, and that being something that's part of what's present. So is that also part of why nunneries would have been in urban spaces, and where the monasteries would have been, or hermitages could have been, much further outside of that?
Let's be very careful and put it this way, and we put it this way. This is the best explanation for this phenomenon. And the way the Vinaya justifies it, or the different, sorry, you know very well that I used the word Vinaya as a kind of generic term. What I was mostly referring to was the Mula Savastivada Vinaya, one special version. When I refer to Schopen, he is always using this specific Vinaya, which has an incredible amount of information, much more than Pali and Vinaya and other similar texts. So it's quite clear that women have to be protected from, for instance, sexual attacks, sexual aggression. And how do you do that? You limit them to the town. You don't allow them to go outside, especially except for some urgent reason. And you avoid two things. They will not get attacked so easily, and women without male protector or company, be it father or brother or son, which is normally when they go outside, normally some male person should go along. So women without a male company, what can they be mistaken for? Prostitutes. And so to avoid, and I made several times, I made a point of the Vinaya trying to guarantee respect for the monks and nuns. So to avoid the impression that a woman in the evening or whenever walking alone outside or somewhere is there on a business trip and not on some religious endeavor. So this seems, because there are quite a few references to this. There's, this very difficult to say if this is correct or not, but Schopen, in one of his many funny papers, mentions a nun who runs a brothel, and successfully, very successfully. And she gets accused. The monks report, or the nuns report to the Buddha, The Buddha is not amused, but because the the people in town, they complain. What did they complain about? Not that a nun ran a brothel, but that she was so successful. So others, non-religious practitioners, did not have the same success in the business. So it's quite interesting, telling us there are lots of angles to it, but generally, many of the rules are designed to avoid misunderstanding of the behavior, and therefore lose respect, which is, as we see today. This is what you see when you move around in Thailand or so. Respect is an extremely important part of the whole religious situation.
Thank you.
Not always depending on reality or earned, deserved or so, but it's ascription to a status. And this has to be preserved by all means.
Thank you. And this, I want to jump back now to the question that an audience member had asked about the role of hermits in this system. So there are largely these nunneries in urban centers, and then in the peri-urban environment in the hinterlands, there are monasteries. And then you mentioned, in addition, there are also hermits who are living alone as single renunciates, male renunciates in this case, in other kinds of places even further away and perhaps truly in the wilderness. Is there anything we can say about the nature of those places? In certain Buddhist contexts, this questioner asked about caves. What is the relationship between the practices of hermits and also cave sites in India? Are those completely different kinds of things?
Yeah, well, as I said before, hermits, they don't leave many material traces. So it's you can't excavate the place of a hermit, especially of a Buddhist hermit sitting, as we know from the texts, on the root of a tree as a good place, or in an empty house, empty hut. So what traces would he or she leave? But we know from, and I come back to this, what I called ascetic poetry, which seems to belong to which seems to be the oldest layer of Buddhist literature, according to our ideas and conclusions, present ideas and conclusions. And confirmed, I refer to the Kagavisana Sutta, the Rhinoceros Sutta, and we have traces of it in the Gandhari, even earlier Gandhari literature, the same verses. So there must have been extremely popular, and if we take them on face value, they describe a very different life. They describe a life of people moving around alone, sitting in this time really in the wilderness, not in the garden, and doing their meditative practices. We don't learn so much about the practices as such, but one important thing is to dissociate, to cut bondages. And this is a recurring, especially family bondages. This is a recurring phenomenon in this literature. And so this seems to describe an earliest phase, which does never disappear. You find I'm sure you find the hermit monk in the forest in Thailand, as we find it in the mountains in Tibet, or in caves in earlier in Central Asia. So the places which are sought for can be caves. This is mentioned. We know, as in the European tradition. Where do hermits stay? Sometimes in caves, when there are natural conditions that allow living in caves. This is quite a normal thing. and this is not specific Buddhists, how do they survive? Because they sort of stop the contact to survive society. It seems to have been possible in the Indian climate that there were always enough fruits, roots, and things. This is what we hear in descriptions. What do these people eat? What do they live on? It's products of the surrounding nature.
And
but again, the interesting thing is the importance these figures retain in the Buddhist tradition. Like, I mean, I'm close to the Tibetan traditions. So Milarepa, the hermit I showed, this is a towering figure, very, very important figure. And not only as something to venerate, somebody to venerate, it's a role model, something you could emulate.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I think you will confirm that from your Southeast Asian experiences. It must be very similar.
Yes, it absolutely is very similar. And we see, again, this kind of arrangement. I think one thing that you were mentioning that we have little traces of the sites in which hermits would have resided because they wouldn't have left material traces. But the cave site that you mentioned, oh yeah, go for it.
Just in addition, I take this again from Tibetan tradition. Sometimes when they become really holy, so when they do have followers, people who go there, visit them, venerate them, exactly as in the European tradition. You have the completely the same phenomena. And then there may be transformations in the place, in the cave. For instance, you have a footprint or so. How to say, stories which are also connected with the Buddha himself, but then transferred to highly advanced followers and traces of spiritual success, which show the holiness of the person and then of the place. And so these are the only kind of material traces of hermits I know of. And then there are, at least in the Tibetan tradition, you go to places where Padmasambhava also left some impression in a cave where he meditated.
Yes, yes, yes. And so the cave sites that you mentioned, like Ajanta and Ellora, are more in the Arama dimension of being a place of pleasure for people to visit and for monastics to live, but they're not remote in the sense of a place where hermits would be, because they wouldn't be a place for true isolation. Is that how those sites should be understood within your broader argument?
One of the questions I find hard to answer, because our present worldview is so different. We jump into a car and drive to the next monastery. Yeah? But at that time, people maybe took an ox cart or a horse, or what did they do to move there, which took a lot of time. So when they went for an excursion, this was not just an afternoon trip, I would suppose, which made it necessary to have places in the monasteries to stay overnight. And it was also possible for women to stay overnight, quite evidently, separately. But this was spaces were provided for this, for such occasions. And one thing, I mean, the Ajanta, this is, although it's partly destroyed, it's still incredible. It's simply incredible. And if you, Ajanta is very often it's compared for us Europeans, it's a very good comparison with the paintings in Pompeii, in Italy. Yeah? The Roman, and the time frame is not so very difficult, very different. And the quality, the sensational matter, and what we see there, there are religious stories, but they are illustrated in a way which is completely urban. You see the kings and queens sitting together and other important people. These are as I said, courts, quite often court scenes. So this may be nice for the monks, but it is especially nice for visitors from outside,
Yes.
which may not have the same nice paintings in their own houses. And another point I want to make, Peter Skilling, and I don't know if he's listening, he could easily elaborate on that. He, among others, drew attention to the point that monasteries are often not far from trade routes. So what seems Ajanta is not very close to a settlement, but as far as I know, a trade route is passing nearby, which would generate a constant, how to say, flux or of people who may stay, who may need a place to stay overnight, a safe place to keep their caravan or their trading stuff, and at the same time to get religious rituals. Wouldn't hurt either, to make a donation, get some protection, have Atanatika Sutra or some texts recited, which you have today, until today in the Parita.
Fantastic.
So
that really makes it, that description really makes it.
this is one of the ways, and I'm glad I'm not the only one who tries to make sense of it in this way. Another point I should add, at least briefly, the stupas. If you look at the huge, like Spahut or Sanchi or the other big stupas, they are not in town. They are usually close or exactly at overland routes, sometimes even at crossings, at the crossing of routes. So this is not by chance, I would say. And these are the stupas are the first stone monuments we have, second and first century. And with all the art, the refined art they were equipped with, this needed a lot of money, a lot of expertise, a lot of support,
Yes.
a lot of donations.
Yes.
So, and again, one could ask, what is the reason for this? Why did people want to donate? And this seems to have be very closely connected to trade, and traders is an important category of people supporting Buddhism.
Thank you. We have another few questions coming in. I want to make sure we get to those as well.
Yes, sorry for talking too long.
Not at all. This is fantastic. The detail again makes everything in your presentation and in the answers to these questions really sparkle for
You're
us.
very nice.
So one question that comes in is like, were there any exceptions to this pattern of monasteries only being outside of towns? Put another way, when was the first example of a truly urban monastery for monks in a Buddhist setting? Something that we, of course, see much later in Buddhist history. But is there a point in which we see that beginning even in South Asia?
How to judge? If you're an archaeologist, you dig out a monastery. How do you know it's for nuns or monks? You cannot take a DNA test at the site. So I think that one of the monasteries in Taxila, the old this old important town in the northwest, Greek origin, and so very important during the trade, and then in Buddhism very important. I think one monastery excavated there inside the settlement was addressed as a monastery for monks. I'm not sure about the argument. I simply don't know it, and I'm not sure if I would be convinced. I think, but it's this, as I said, it's very, very difficult to say. we take since I'm a man of the literature, so I read a text, and I'm always in danger of taking the text literally. So people like Schopen, they are extremely important for people like me to warn me that we should take other material like archaeological finds into consideration. I have the Vinaya, and the Vinaya says there's a division, there's a split. So if we look at, I showed Depung, this huge monastery, and it was not the only one around Lhasa. There were 3 such huge monastic universities. They were all outside Lhasa. They were in the countryside. But in modern, if you look at Bangkok, none of the monasteries of the famous monasteries the tourists go to is outside the town. It's impossible. So when the growth of a town sort of overran the place of a monastery, it's difficult to say when that started. I think that generally Buddhism has been, on one hand, very conservative, trying to keep, protect, and honor the rules and regulations prescribed by the Buddha himself. And on the other hand, it's been incredibly adaptable. Is this an English word?
Absolutely.
And this is the reason why it survived, and survived so wonderfully until today, because it could adjust even to monks using a subway or an airplane, which not now, because now you can pay with plastic card. But there was a time, a couple of decades ago, when monks had to touch money, which is forbidden. If you take the Vinaya literally, they are not allowed to touch gold or silver or money.
And
But sorry.
Oh, sorry, just on that point about money, one of the members of the audience was asking about if there's a point in time we can understand the transition in terms of goods that were donated to monasteries or nunneries. Again, as you mentioned, the Vinaya early Vinaya traditions really emphasized monks and nuns not being able to handle money. And yet, even in the story of Anathapindra, the monastery is donated, was paid for through coinage to its original owner, and then donated as land. But at a certain point, of course, in this, I presume is quite present in the Mulasarastivada Vinaya, there's money becomes quite important.
In all the Vinayas. And I mean, coming back to Anathapindra's story, if there are scholars of the opinion that this is just a joke to cover the because nowhere in ancient India at that time enough coins would have been available. So, but still, it's a very nice story. And the point is, none of the monks touches the coins. So these are workers for Anathapindra. The whole thing, the fiscal side, the money side is handled by other people, non-religious practitioners. And this is the same in the monasteries. You have people who are employed, and they are not ordained monks or nuns, are employed in the monastery to handle these, exactly this business, these affairs, which is forbidden to monks and nuns. So, and this is already these, how to say, these administrative roles or functions, they are already introduced in the Vinaya. So the Buddha himself is said to have introduced them. So the Vinaya is aware of the problem and also of a way to solve it. It's not been absolutely necessary. On the other hand, Schopen again tells us that monks and nuns could, when they died, that there was something to pass on. They had something. And there are rules how to deal with it. So they were not completely possessionless. And they could also, it appears they could also have um, values like money or so, possibly commercial values. And what we know from the, come back to the stupas. The stupas, quite often we find inscriptions, donative inscriptions, donors. And among the donors, there are merchants, of course, and similar professions, but there are also monks and nuns who appear as donors. So they must have had some possession from donations, most likely from, like today in Western religious environment or in Eastern religious environment. Let's take Khyentse Rinpoche as an example. He doesn't run around taking the money himself, but he is collecting donations. And so this model, I think it's which emulates a model which goes back 2,000 years.
Yeah.
I believe.
And I think one of
There's nothing against it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the audience members asked specifically around Chopin's arguments in this regard, sort of, as you mentioned, both monks and nuns in this early period, according to the different Vinaya traditions, could accrue significant economic power. And this audience member specifically wanted to ask about sort of Chopin's views on the role of women and nuns as donors to early Buddhist institutions, which seems like archaeological evidence show that women may have had more economic power in certain contexts. How does in terms of how you look at the text, how does that pan out?
It seems so. I mean, inscriptions, donative inscriptions, you can simply count them. There's always a history. I mean, we don't have millions of them, not even thousands, I would say. So there's always a chance. A chance factor that we have more of female of nuns than of monks, but generally this fits very nicely. I mean, Chopin, he likes that, of course, his view on Buddhism, Buddhist texts, and so and the reality of the life of the Buddhist order. He likes such indications and stories, and justly so to some extent. I would say it's easily explained by the location of the monasteries. Monks outside, nuns inside. So the donor is just living next street. Yeah? It's you can all every day you may go there and say you have a very nice, you want to contribute to some monastery and or some stupa or raise a Buddha, have a Buddha statue carved or so. This would be the easiest way, the easy access, and living in the right in the right places. And of course, I observed this phenomenon when we did in the 80s some research on modern Buddhist movements, on revival movements of modern Buddhism in Nepal. There were nuns, very famous, attracting a lot of support from lay people, even to the degree that monks were, how to say, slightly envious, one could understand it that way. So nuns, like monks, they can build up charisma. Yeah? And to the same, and sometimes even to a higher degree, I would say, depending on the social surrounding, on the general situation.
And one of, again, an audience member asked about what the urban location of nunneries says about the social class of nuns. You mentioned certainly about this rule regarding prohibiting the monks who were teaching nuns, not prohibiting, but making sure that they knew urban speech so that they were able to properly converse with nuns, or another way of saying it, sort of protecting monks from being ridiculed by the eloquent ways of speech
Exactly.
of the nuns.
It's a very nice story, isn't it? Huh?
And so that the location also seems to be indicating where they're drawing recruits, as it were, to new nuns or new monks as well. That is, that does that mean, on the other hand, that monks who were joining monasteries were likely coming from the immediate surrounding areas, not people who were males who were dropouts of urban society?
Very good question. And here I feel unable to give a convincing answer, because the information we have does not, I could elaborate something, but it would not be based on very solid material, very solid ground. And so I'm reluctant. We have the phenomenon that there were wealthy nuns, quite evident, and this is absolutely sure, since we have these inscriptions. We have indications in the Vinaya, but the one thing which I find unexplained and which puzzled me since I started to take interest is the disappearance of the order of nuns in most traditions, especially in, I mean, the Indian tradition. So both have disappeared, but in the Theravada in Thailand, in Sri Lanka, Ceylon. So, and this is not a phenomenon of modernity. It seems to start quite early, and I at least have no explanation for it. One thing we do not know. So this is very, how to say, it's not solid, not very solid argument, but it seems that Buddhism, the success, Buddhist, if the dating is correct, the Buddha 100 years before Ashoka or so, this must have been a tremendous success. India is not just a country, it's a subcontinent. So in a very short time, this movement spread all over the place. So it must have been something, it must have had something to offer, which was very important for the people. So people were very interested to support and promote and whatever. So why does this stop? One thing is an explanation which is generally made use of is the disappearance of the long distance trade, especially the interruption of the connection with the Silk Road. So when trade disappeared, merchants disappeared, and the prophets disappeared. And the prophets, this is something we have to remember, the prophets must have been enormous in this international trade. Pliny in Rome is in the 1st century after the beginning of the Common Era, is explaining about the negative trade balance. Is that the correct English word?
Yeah, correct.
Very negative trade balance. Hundreds of millions of sesterces going to India every year, because there's luxury people in Rome, they wanted to have pepper and all these things. So this means that the traders, they earned a lot, they invested a lot, but once they disappeared, Buddhism was perhaps not, as long as a movement is successful, it will attract followers and also renunciants, people who find this model attractive to become a member of the order. So perhaps there's also some, at least partly, an economic background, which we do not, at the moment, are unable to really see. So this is not a good answer, but this is instead of an answer which would have told you why and how the nuns got replacements.
No, thank you. That was a fantastically detailed and stimulating answer. And we were coming to the end of our time, so I just want to ask one more question, and it relates to something that you mentioned in the middle of your talk, and that is some of the evidence in the Vinaya, as well as when we compare it to archaeological evidence, suggests that what shows us that the Vinaya was changing over time as the social conditions of Buddhism were changing over time. And certain stories that appear in the Vinaya, and perhaps also in the suttas, could not have been as early as they claim to be because of what we know of how the social conditions changed. And they couldn't have changed, for instance, so rapidly within the lifetime of the Buddha himself, but would have to have changed in subsequent centuries. If we're to think about that methodology and apply it not maybe so much to the Vinaya, but to different chronological layers in the early sutras, what does it tell us about the development of that body of Buddhist literature? What does the changing social conditions, as witnessed through, say, the Vinaya or through archaeology, tell us about the chronological layers present in early Buddhist texts?
This is the second question, which is difficult to answer, to say the least. And I do not pretend to have a good answer ready. The sutras, they are extremely homogeneous. I find it, I wouldn't dare, people try to do that, but all the attempts I've seen so far have neither impressed me nor convinced me. That it is possible to see layers of development. In the Vinaya, because this is concerned with realia, real things, not with dogmatics or with doctrine. With regard to doctrine, you can also try to see ideas, terms, and so, which must be very early, and others which are likely were added later, because they are not in every tradition, in every Buddhist tradition. You don't find them everywhere. And so this is always an indication of a regional or later development. But to see a social, in the Vinaya describes a social process, and my funny example is always, you start with homeless ascetics, and the Vinaya describes toilets. Homeless ascetics living in the wilderness don't need toilets. And so toilets in a monastery. So this is easy to see what is how to organize a toilet must be later than this pre-requires a monastery, and the monastery pre-requires something else. So here you can build a chain or see at least phases in a process. But in the Sutta Pitaka, I find that extremely difficult. And and you mentioned that I've been working, or still am working with the Agama, the long collection, corresponding to the Digha Nikaya. So it is different from the Digha Nikaya, but you are, on the other hand, you are impressed by the similarity, which, if you would ask me which of the two collections is earlier, I would say draw a straw or throw a coin.
Yes.
It's very, very difficult. So this would, and I think this is not so interesting, you would have to go into much more chronological, into much more terminological detail. I give you one example, just one example, because it's something I'm working with now. There's the idea that the Buddha taught with one word, and the audience, everybody understood something else. This is as you know from university, this is the normal situation we as teachers experience. We say a sentence and most of the people understand their own things and they don't understand it correctly. And so, but no, the Buddha is different. The Buddha says a sentence and everybody in the audience understands it according to his inclinations and his needs. So this is, he hears something which is beneficial for him. Yeah? And this idea of a simultaneous, how to say, instruction, this is available in some early traditions, but not in all. You don't have this in the Theravada. There's nothing like that. Yeah? And there's a discussion in later texts, which Buddhist school, in later Buddhist texts, 5th, 6th century texts, which discuss which schools subscribe to this idea. Mm. So this must be something which was added at a later point. And at a point which, this is a very common idea in Mahayana sutras. Yeah? So but you also have it in canonical Buddhism, but apparently not belonging to the oldest layers. This is an interesting, very interesting example. But it shows that you can differentiate, but it's very difficult to do so, and you get only a relative chronology, if at all, no absolute figures.
Yes, yes. I can't emphasize enough what an wonderful and enriching lecture this was. A number of people in the audience messaged, just to say this was wonderful and they wish that your talk was longer. So I'm sorry that we're now coming to the end of our time together today. So thank you again very much, Professor Hartmann, for sharing this time and for your talk and for your really engaging responses. And thank you everyone in the audience for asking these questions, to be able to have this.
Let me share in thanking the audience for the patience, for listening at all. And I hope it made a little bit of sense at least. So thank you very much. Have a nice weekend, everybody.
Thank you very much, Professor. And before we end, I wanted to draw everyone's attention to the next talk in the series, which will be by Professor Friedrich Ferdinand Roman of Furtwang University. This will take place on the 25th of June next month, the time still to be announced. The lecture will be in Mandarin Chinese and will be hosted by my esteemed colleague, Dr. Mingyuan Gao, on the subject of who could be called the Bodhisattva. If you're on Khyentse Foundation mailing list, you'll receive more info about Professor Goldman's lecture in early June. And as always, to stay in touch about upcoming events, visit khyentsefoundation.org/events, and also specifically for this series, khyentsefoundation.org/the Goodman Lectures. Thank you again for joining us in whatever time zone you're coming with and spending this time. We hope to see you all again soon. May you all be safe and well.